Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lara and today I'm going to be doing a review of The Samurai by Shusaku Endo. This is a review that I wouldn't say is particularly structured like my normal reviews. This is just a book that I want to gush about for the next, 5 to 10 minutes. This is one of the best books I've ever read. We are essentially following two main characters. On the one hand, we're following a priest from the Franciscan order who goes by the name of Rodriguez. And on the other hand, we are following a samurai who throughout the book is mostly called the Samurai. We do know his name, and that is Rokumon Hasakura. The book is written from these two perspectives. And we get a really interesting kind of contrast between these two people because they come from very different backgrounds. Our priest Rodriguez is naturally going to be deeply Catholic. He essentially went over to Japan as a missionary and has been trying in earnest to try to convert the Japanese from Buddhism to Catholicism. On the other hand, we have Hasakura, and he is a samurai, but he's also kind of a samurai who is lower down the totem pole. He does own land and he does have people working for him, but he is also often doing manual labor. He's often kind of in the field with the peasants, helping them. So he's not necessarily like a really highly ranked or highly respected samurai that you see in other, fiction books about Japan, like Shogun as an example. Both of these characters are so fascinating because at the start, we see the stark differences between these two men, but by the end of the book, we begin to realize that they're actually very similar and they're both going through similar struggles, but just in slightly different ways. Our priest, Rodriguez, is going through the struggle of essentially trying to play like a really critical role in bringing Catholicism to Japan, but he's also quite arrogant and he's quite egotistical, which I think if you know anything about Christianity, and I think most religions are quite like this, they try to remove that sense of individualism. And yet our priest Rodriguez is all about himself and elevating himself and the role that he has. His desire is to become like the chief priest in Japan. And there is this really interesting battle between the Franciscan order and the Jesuit order in terms of who can convert the most amount of Catholics. It's such a fascinating thing that even in a religion like Christianity, and I think we see this with a lot of major religions, that there is often this infighting between various different sects. And we see this very clearly between the Franciscans and the Jesuits as they try to further their claim on Japanese land. I think one of the most interesting arcs I've ever seen written is Rodriguez's arc, because he starts out as incredibly egotistical, but by the end of the book, and because of what he goes through, he's incredibly humbled. His ending is almost kind of where he started, but his mindset has changed. And it's so fascinating to see him go through that realization over the course of this book. Like, we see and hear every single thing that happens to him and his thought process as he's going through those things. And we see the moments that cause him to change his belief system. It is absolutely incredible to see. I've not seen an author write a character this well developed in some time. Like, I really am not exaggerating, because you really see his belief system change over the course of about 300 pages. And it's done in a way that feels incredibly organic, and it's done in a way that makes sense to what this individual has gone through. Like, it's truly, truly remarkable. Now, the samurai is an interesting character because he, starts out as this kind of very under the radar samurai. He's a lord, but as I said at the start, he's very much at the bottom of the totem pole as a samurai. Like, he's not super highly respected. He's not a high ranking official. Like, he's just a guy trying to do his job, essentially. He gets this opportunity to go on this voyage over to essentially what is Mexico, and to facilitate trade relations between Mexico and Japan. He is one of those people that he kind of believes at the start of this book that he would never leave his home. He would always stay in Japan. He would live his life and die in Japan. And so he gets this opportunity to go on this incredible voyage over to South America, but then also to Europe. And he sees the world And at the start, he hates that. You know, he has this hatred for the wider world. He's quite insular in the sense that he just wants to stay at home and be with his family and see his children grow up and work in partnership with the people that work for him. And so him going abroad is this very uncomfortable experience. And it's really interesting to see, because I think a lot of people in today's world, you know, I love to travel. Well, I don't like traveling, like the process of traveling. Like I like arriving at my end destination. The point is, I like going to new places to discover new things and learn about new cultures and things like that. And yet we have someone like Hasakura, and yes, admittedly, the time is different and the mode of transportation is different. They go by boat and it takes them months to get to their destination. So obviously it's a lot more brutal. But it's so interesting to see his perception of a foreign world, having never left his tiny village in this kind of rural part of Japan. And we see how over time he begins to adapt to these new cultures, how he begins to adapt to all of these different situations. And by the end of it, he's become a much more well-rounded person, because he's explored parts of the world that he never ever would have got the opportunity to if he hadn't have gone on this expedition, essentially. This is what I'm going to say about these two characters. I'm not going to say kind of anything about their end journeys, because I really do think you need to kind of experience that for yourself. But it's really interesting to see these two people almost have inverted journeys. Like, I think Rodriguez becomes more humbled by the end of the book, whereas I think Hasakura becomes more emboldened by the end of the book. They both almost are opposite sides of the spectrum, and at some point they kind of both meet in the middle. And it's really interesting to see not only how they both independently go about their journeys, but how they also interact as they're both on that journey as well. There is also a really incredibly rich secondary cast of characters that I'm not going to talk about just for the sake of time. But this is one of those books where every single character matters, every single character has consequence on the wider events of this world. We get a really interesting parallel actually into the hierarchy and the systems of both the Catholic Church, but also the way that kind of the feudal system in Japan was set up as well. Both systems are incredibly hierarchical. Both systems rely on there being a chief at the top and then a bunch of people underneath that doing their bidding. And it's fascinating to see that, because that's not necessarily something that you would compare naturally. You wouldn't necessarily compare the Catholic Church to feudal Japan and the way the feudal Japan was set up and run, right? It's just not a natural comparison that you would make. And yet we see that both of these systems are run by people who to some extent are greedy on a personal level, but also to a larger extent, they only care about perpetuating these systems insofar as they benefit both of these individuals. And that was something that I found really fascinating, is that even our shogun, who is, you know, supposed to be extremely honorable, only really cares about doing what he needs to do so that he is top dog. And then on the other side, we have the ultimate leader of the Catholic Church, the Pope, and ultimately, he only really cares about himself and perpetuating a regime that benefits him and his family. Like, it's so fascinating. And obviously, the feudal system in Japan isn't based on religion. Obviously, Buddhism plays a big role, and to some extent, Christianity later on. But at that point, Buddhism was the main religion, and it wasn't ruled by Buddhism necessarily. Obviously, it had a role to play, but it was really this kind of rule system that ruled it. Whereas obviously Christianity is ruled by, you know, in theory, by the word of God. One of the most interesting parallels that comes up by the end of this book is that they are both run like governments, and they are both run like political systems. Even though to some extent they're both ruled by religion, they're actually in fact political systems at their heart. And it's because they are political systems that many issues arise for our characters, but also for the broader Catholic Church and then the Japanese lords as well. Like, it's just so well done. It's not something that is presented to us as black and white as that. But if you read this book in a way that, you know, you really take it in, you begin to draw parallels between these kind of two incredibly powerful institutions, even though things are positioned to be done in the name of, you know, religion or in the name of specific ruler. Really what they're trying to defend is the political system that underpins that, because that's what enables them to be at the top. Naturally, with a book like this, there's a lot of historical context that I think if you're somebody who's read Shogun or Musashi, or you know a little bit about kind of 17th century Japan, kind of the unification of Japan, what was happening with religion in Japan, then I think this is a book that you'd really enjoy. I think also, if you don't know any of that, I think you should read a little bit before you go into it. The translator actually did a really good job of introducing some of the main historical points at the start of the book, which I did read, but I knew quite a lot of it before just because I've read a decent amount about this period of history now. It's a time where there's a lot of political and religious strife. There's this desire on the Japanese side to close off its borders to people who are foreigners. That it's set in the backdrop of when the Tokugawa shogunate essentially banned Christianity in Japan. It ceased to exist publicly, but there were people who still, in theory, practiced the religion, and there were still missionaries going over there trying to convert people. If they were found to be doing that, they'd either be banished from the island or they would be killed. And so there is a lot of religious tension, but then there is also a lot of political tension, because at this point in history, there was a lot of infighting between the various feudal lords in Japan. And then on the Catholicism side, there was also infighting in that regard as well. We had, you know, the Jesuits and the Franciscans kind of fighting against each other. This was also, you know, during the Renaissance in Italy. So while there was a lot of really incredible, you know, scientific endeavors and artistic endeavors very much being promoted, there was also a lot of infighting between the various different houses in Italy and Spain at the time as well. So it's a very interesting period of history for both of these kind of separate entities, because both were going through a lot of really positive change, but at the same time there was a lot of strife happening on the ground too. So it's very interesting to compare, say, like Italy to Japan at this time, because you could argue that Japan in some ways was slightly more politically stable than Italy, but then Italy had this incredible renaissance where we had this explosion of art and music and exploration. Like, there was just so much happening, and you could argue a lot of that was happening was because Italy was the center of Europe, which I think is really interesting when you compare it to Japan, where it kind of closed its borders and didn't want anyone to be going there and wanted to keep itself to itself, which I think is just, again, another really interesting comparison point, because you compare both of these countries that were almost going through quite similar things at the same time, and yet they both took very different approaches, and you can see how it impacted both of them positively but also negatively. The historical context is absolutely fascinating. We also naturally go to Mexico quite a lot, and there is some really interesting exploration about the treatment of the native population in Mexico by the church. They were naturally treated like second-class citizens, often murdered and taken away from their homes by the Catholic Church. They were forced to be baptized, and they were forced to be a part of a religion that they didn't necessarily understand, because, you know, Christopher Columbus went over there and, you know, did what he did. We're not going to go into that right now, but it's quite a dark period of history as well in many ways, and we see that come up when the characters go to Mexico and they see what's happening to the indigenous population of that country. And I think the concern is for our samurai and for the people that go with him is this what's going to happen to us if we let these people into our country? One other thing that I will mention about the kind of historical context as it relates to this world is that this book makes it very clear that there was no separation between church and state. Church and state were very much intertwined. Trade was ruled by the Catholic Church, and to some extent the Protestants, but we won't talk about the Protestants because they weren't really a focal point of this book. We see, obviously, the story from the perspective of a Catholic priest. So everything as it related to trade and commerce all came from the church. It was all controlled by the church. The governments were run by religious figures, whether it's Spain, obviously Italy, and then obviously Mexico. There is no separation between church and state. They are very much one and the same thing. And trade was almost used as a bartering tool to allow these missionaries into a specific land. So as an example, the reason why the Japanese go over to Mexico in this book is because they want to open up a trade route between Mexico and Japan. Now, if the Japanese are allowed to trade in Mexico, they obviously have to give something back, and that is the ability to the Catholic Church to proselytize in Japan, right? So they're able to go over there, be missionaries, try to convert people, build churches, all of that stuff. And so they're completely intertwined. There is no separation. And even on the samurai side, as I mentioned earlier, Buddhism very much functions as an element of how they do business, of how they get things done. It's really interesting to see, because obviously now we don't really have that. I mean, in the UK, it's a secular country, right? So we don't have that combination of church and state, even though that does sometimes come up. But in theory, it is a secular country, right? And trade is tied to religious activities. So seeing it in the perspective of, 17th century Europe and 17th century Japan, when naturally these things were very much intertwined, was really fascinating to read, because you couldn't have one or the other. You either had to accept both or reject both at the same time if you were on the other side of the table. Another thing that I really want to mention about this book is the exploration around faith. As I kind of alluded to at the start of this video, as I've obviously spoken a lot about religion in this book, faith obviously comes into that. And I think we see all of our different characters' faith get shaken up in multiple different ways. I think one of the really interesting things about our Japanese characters is that we see them feign belief because they see it as a means to an end. So some of them, this is not really a spoiler, but some of them pretend to get baptized so that it opens up trade for them, right? But they don't actually believe in Catholicism. They don't believe in Jesus, and they don't believe in God, or they don't believe in the things that, Catholics believe in. They literally used it as a way to then forge bonds with Catholics who they then would trade with. So it's literally seen as a means to an end. And it's really interesting because our priest, Rodriguez, knows this. And yet he's constantly trying to force them to get baptized, even though he knows it's not because they actually believe in it. It's because they see it as this means to an end. And I think that's one of the things that really struck me about this book, is the fact that our priest, he's so obsessed with converting them that he doesn't actually care about them becoming Catholics because they actually believe in what he's saying. They actually believe in what the word of Jesus Christ is. Like, they don't care. And in a way, he doesn't care either. He just wants them to be Christians. He wants them to be Catholics so he can say, I converted them to Catholicism and I'm top dog. And it all comes from ego. It doesn't come from an actual desire to spread the word of the Catholic Church. It comes from the desire to be recognized as someone who played a critical role in bringing Catholicism to Japan, which ultimately comes from ego. And that was one of my favorite things about this book, is the fact that faith and ego can often be tied very closely together. I think faith can be very pure, and I think in the same instance, it can also be very corrupt. And I think Rodriguez is a really good example of like how faith and the weaponization of faith can be incredibly corrupt and disturbing, and how it can be used in a way that ends up actually putting people off it, because the tactics that they use are so disgusting, and the tactics that they use are so like dishonest. Fascinating to read, because I've never ever read a book that's kind of addressed that so bluntly. And bear in mind, Shusaku Endo was Catholic. He is obviously Japanese. He was a Japanese Catholic, and I believe he was quite religious. He's writing this from the perspective of somebody who follows that religion, and he's being very critical of that religion, which I really respect that he was able to do it. And he was able to do it in a way that didn't necessarily vilify Catholicism. He did it in a way that I think made these characters very human, and Catholicism was just the backdrop of that. It wasn't, the conclusion isn't Catholicism is bad because it makes people do things that are bad. The conclusion is that this person is trying to weaponize a religion and is trying to use that religion to further his own means. And I think that's the crux of this book. And I think when we look at the world today, and I really hate to be that person who's like, well, look at the world today. But like, seriously, look at the world today and look at how people weaponize religion so much. Pretty much most of the major world wars that we've had throughout history have been because people have weaponized religion. They have used religion to further their own means. Because by its very intrinsic nature, whether you look at the major world religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, let's just take those three monotheistic religions as an example. If you actually look at the scripture of these religions, and I'm not an expert at all, so take this with a pinch of salt. But I think if you look at the core values of each of these religions, not only do they share a lot of the same values, but their values are pure. And I think if you are a good person and you try to live by those values, I think in that way religion can be a force for good. And I think if you take it in its pure form and you don't try to use it for your own self-aggrandizing means, religion can actually be a really beautiful thing. Where it goes wrong is where people try to weaponize it for their own reasons, where they corrupt religion to further their own individual goals or their broader organization's goals, whether it's a specific order or a specific sect in a religion, or whether it's a political system. It doesn't really matter, but that's where it gets corrupted and that's where it goes wrong. And I think that's the key lesson that I took from this book, is that religion in itself is not evil. It's the fact that people use it and they corrupt it, and that's what makes it evil. But that's not the religion's fault. That's the individual's fault or the collective's fault, because they're portraying, they are corrupting the message of a specific system, right? That's not to say that every single religion is perfect. That's obviously not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that I think if you look at the kind of core value systems of each of these religions that I just mentioned, and if, again, look at it in the context of this book, Catholicism, I don't necessarily think Catholicism is bad, right? I think you can see the benefits of religion throughout the history of time. But where it becomes really disturbing and where it becomes really bad for people and society through a broader lens is where it becomes weaponized, where it's used in a way that manipulates people and isolates people and puts them in situations they wouldn't have been in if they hadn't have followed that religion. So it's just really incredible, this book. Like, it's really incredible. I mean, I've been talking about it for 30 minutes, which I did not anticipate that would happen. But like, it's such a deeply thematic piece of work that even though it's 300 pages, for goodness sake, like, it's not a long book by any means. Like, Shogun is a 900-page book. I took more from this book as it related to the kind of political and religious themes, far more than I did from Shogun, because it just does a really good job of showing how these systems, how these organizations perpetuate the same kind of narratives, despite what religion is, despite what kind of affiliation it has. Like, they all perpetuate similar systems. And that's not because of the religion itself. It's because of the people who espouse the beliefs of that religion. It's because of the people who are at the top of that totem pole in that religion, whether it's the Pope or the cardinals, or whether it's the shogun or the feudal lords. Like, it doesn't matter. It's the system is rigged in a way, and it's always going to be rigged, regardless of the religion, regardless of the people. It's always going to be rigged because that's human nature. This is one of those books that I think should be studied by people. This is one of those books that I think if you're a person who subscribes to a religious belief, I think you should read this book, because I think it will challenge you to think about the systems that are present in whatever religion that you're affiliated with. But I also think from the lens of somebody who maybe doesn't believe in religion or doesn't believe in God or isn't sure about it, I think it does a really good job of showing why people have faith and why faith is such an intrinsic part of human nature and society, and why people feel they need to believe in something. And so I think it's got something for everybody. I think it's one of those books that is just incredibly rich and detailed, and I think really asks these questions in a very sensitive yet layered way. The last thing that I'm going to mention is maybe some trigger warnings. This is a very dark book. Like, it doesn't necessarily seem like it on the surface, but I think there's some really dark aspects to this book. As I mentioned earlier, we do see kind of what happens to the indigenous peoples of Mexico and how they're treated. I think there is also, as I've kind of alluded to, there is that shows the darker side of religion and how people can become so fervent in their belief that it ends up almost having the opposite effect. There's some very grim imagery in the world, and you can feel the anguish of every single character. You can feel the anguish of all the people that we visit in this world. If you're not kind of ready for that, or if that's not something that you want to read, then please do bear that in mind. The last thing that I will mention, because this is over 30 minutes long now, is that I think the ending of this book is so good, because what we realise, along with our characters by the end of it, is that no matter what system you're a part of, nobody really cares about you, and you're going to be alone on that journey, regardless of whether you're a part of a bigger, broader belief system or not. You know, you could be a member of the Catholic Church, a priest in the Catholic Church, be somebody who's been a missionary, been somebody who has converted people and espoused the word of God. And yet you get treated in a way that doesn't respect what you've done. And on the other side, you could be somebody who's toiled and toiled for your feudal lord. And yet it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really mean anything. And it brings into this question, this really interesting thing about why people do what they do, right? Why do people then continue to believe, even if those systems almost ignore them and forget about them and chuck them out to some extent? It's quite an emotional ending, because that realization that our characters have is not that easy to read. Like I found it quite hard to read. I found it quite emotional to read, because that's a very hard realization to have, that you could be a part of the Catholic Church, you could be a part of a shogunate that is supposed to be fair and balanced, and you could do everything right, you could do everything that is expected of you. And even though you shouldn't be doing it for reward and for praise, the fact that you are still kind of left out shows that it doesn't really matter kind of what system you're in, because they ultimately don't really care about you. I think that's quite a hard thing, I think, for people to realize. I think even, if you're part of a religious institution, like, that can happen. And we literally see that happen to one of our main characters. And so it then also brings into this question around, like, especially as it relates to Rodriguez, like, the Catholic Church is a very hierarchical organization, right? Like, why do I have to follow the rules of multiple different priests and then cardinals and then the Pope, when really I could just talk directly to God? Why do you need to go through a middleman? And the same on the samurai side. Why do I need to define an allegiance to someone when ultimately that person doesn't really care about me, and I'm just in my little village in rural Japan and I'm doing what I do? But, like, why do I need to be a part of that system when it doesn't actually respect my role in that system? Very interesting thematic work here, because then it also brings up the question, like, should you really be doing it for that, right? Like, if you really believe in God, like, should you be doing it for recognition? Should you be doing it? Like, obviously not, but at the same time, I think when the institution or the system is set up in a way that rewards certain types of people, it's naturally then going to cause an imbalance and an expectation that you get that reward, if that makes sense. Anyway, I'm really getting deep into this. I didn't intend for this to be a 35-minute plus long video. I think I'm going to stop there, because honestly, I could keep talking about this, because it truly is incredible. It truly does bring up some really fascinating questions. I think from where we start to where we end up, our characters go through an incredible journey that I think a lot of people could relate to, regardless of whether you believe in religion or not, regardless of whether, you're a patriot or not, regardless. Like, I think it's just one of those books that I think everyone can pull something from. And I think if any of what I've just said appeals to you, then I think you should definitely pick it up. It's a very short read. It's one of those books that you can read pretty quickly. I read it a bit slower because I was just lapping it up. The writing is beautiful. The characters are well developed. The pacing is perfect. Like, everything in this book really works for me. The world building is also incredible, because we really get a distinct sense of what each of these places look like, whether it's Mexico or the various different places that they go to in Spain. They go to Madrid and they also go to Sevilla, which I've been to Sevilla many times. It's one of my favorite places in the world. And so it felt really nice to kind of feel a level of familiarity with the world, because they talk about, like, the Arab influences on the architecture, but then also the beautiful big cathedrals. So it's like a really kind of interesting to see it through people who have no reference to that world. And then obviously we go to the heart of the Catholic Church, which is the Vatican, right? And we get some world building around that as well. So it's just a perfect book, like, genuinely. One of my favorite books, without a doubt, one of, if not the best book that I've read this year. Definitely going to reread it again multiple times. And I definitely am going to pick up Silence as well at some point too. So if you're interested in Japanese history, if you're interested in kind of Catholicism and the spread of Catholicism, both throughout the world, but kind of in Japan as well, and if you're interested in the kind of idea of faith and, why people believe the things that they do, if you're also the sort of person that likes kind of very intimate character studies that are very multi-layered and detailed, then you have to pick up this book. Like, it's perfect. It's so good. I've never seen anybody talk about it. So let me know down below in the comments if you have read it. If you haven't, Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them. Like, it's just perfect, this book, and more people need to read it. Please tell me if you do end up picking it up, because it's so good. I'm going to stop there now because I'll just keep going. Please give this video a thumbs up if you like it. It really does help, and it would be really good if more people could see this book, because I think it really deserves more attention. Thanks for watching. As always, stay safe, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks, guys.